Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And in this lecture, we're going to learn about war. We're going to follow that outline as we gather together all of the information required to answer that question at the very top. Who won King Philip's War? We pick up our story with the June 19th demand of 1675, a demand made by the governor of Plymouth, Josiah Winslow, towards Metacom, King Philip, leader of the Wampanoag Nation. Winslow was demanding that King Philip appear at Plymouth and explain himself about a series of rumored land deals taking place between the Wampanoag Nation and the Massachusetts colony. Now, remember that Plymouth itself is very insecure about its relationship on the landscape of Puritan New England. They don't have a royal charter. They had no legal authority to settle here at all back in 1620. And they're desperately afraid of being swallowed by the much larger and wealthier Massachusetts colony based out of Boston. They are really insecure, and they actually passed a law saying that the Wampanoag Nation is not allowed to sell land to Massachusetts Bay, despite the fact that Plymouth has no legal authority over either the Wampanoag Nation or the Massachusetts Bay colony. But to Metacom, to King Philip, this is a really loaded demand because it was exactly under such pretenses that his brother Wamsutta, King Alexander, was lured to his death at Plymouth back in 1662. So to Metacom, this demand is an attempt on his life. And it is because of these reasons that King Philip listens to his war captains and begins the preparations for King Philip's war. Throughout the summer of 1675, King Philip begins stockpiling weapons. He gathers his war captains, he pulls warriors towards him, and he begins to recruit allies across New England. He sends emissaries loaded down with belts of wampum. He sends them north to the Nipmucks, and he tells them of this great uprising that he is planning. The Nipmucks think about it, and they're on board. He sends emissaries north to the Wabanakis, to the Penacooks, asking for their help in his great war against the English. The Wabanakis and the Penacooks agree to aid King Philip. He sends emissaries to the west, to the very powerful Mohegan Nation out by the Connecticut River. And the Mohegans say no. The Mohegans say, look, man, we get along really well with the Connecticut colony. We're not having the kind of problems that you Wampanoags are having in the east. Count us out of your problems. The Mohegans tell him no. King Philip even sends emissaries to the old enemies of the Wampanoag, the Narragansetts, the arch rivals of the Wampanoag. And he says, I'm planning this great war against the English. Are you on board? And the Narragansetts say no. The Narragansetts say, look, man, you've got to be joking asking us for help. You killed all of our allies, the Pequod. And it's you guys, it's because of you guys the English are here in the first place. The Narragansetts completely turn King Philip down. But they're not entirely cool to the Wampanoags. They say, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do. We're going to build this huge stockade in the swamp. We're going to build this huge stockade that's going to be this really powerful fortress. And we know that if this war comes, we're actually kind of related to you because they've been intermarrying for a couple generations. I tell you what, send us your really vulnerable population. Send us the really vulnerable people of the Wampanoag Nation. You're old, you're sick, you're disabled, you're pregnant women, you're little kids. Send them to us and we will take care of them while you guys fight this terrible war. And King Philip of the Wampanoag, King Philip says, that's fair. That's fair. Okay. That's okay with that. But the other thing that the Narragansetts do is the Narragansetts send word to Roger Williams down in Providence, because the Narragansetts get along great with these kind of hippie Christian pacifists down in Rhode Island. And they say, look, Roger Williams, you've always been straight with us and we've always been straight with you. We think war is coming and you guys have got to prepare, okay? Get yourselves ready for this firestorm that's about to erupt. But Roger Williams sees this as an opportunity. Roger Williams says, God wants me to do something. God wants me to try and prevent this war. So Roger Williams, this lunatic, this Christian pacifist, gets together a couple people and he goes to King Philip's home at Mount Hope. and he tries to talk King Philip out of launching King Philip's War. And what comes out of this discussion between Roger Williams and King Philip is this really interesting document, a document that has gone into the historical record as Metacoms Complaint, because Roger Williams writes all this stuff down, and King Philip builds this really eloquent defense of war. He lists these reasons why this war is going to happen and why Roger Williams cannot talk him out of it. And I've boiled down Metacoms Complaint into its 7 main points right here. And let's run through these points very quickly. Number 1, he says the Wampanoags are being poorly repaid for their past generosity, i.e. the Puritans of New England owe the Wampanoags everything. Because if it wasn't for my dad, King Massasoit, if it wasn't for King Massasoit, all of you people would have starved to death back in 1621. And we are being treated very badly. And we helped you guys out, and you guys are not helping us out. 2, King Philip points out that the Puritans killed my brother. All right, Wamsutta died in Plymouth back in 1662. You killed the son of the man who helped you, and you antagonized his brother, who's now the new king. 3, he says the English only believe the Indians when it suits them. If there's ever a dispute between an English Puritan and a Native American, they always take the side of the English settler. And this is not fair. Number 4, King Philip says that the English cheat on land deals, often taking much more land than they purchased. They will purchase land that says we're buying all the land between the river and this big rock, and then they'll move this big rock. They'll say we're buying all of the land between the coast and the edge of the forest, and then they'll cut down 30 acres of forest and claim that that's the new edge of the forest. They cheat all the time. And when the Indians complain and take the Puritan settlers to court, it goes back to point 3. The English always side with other English. 5, Metacom complains that the English trade liquor and are addicting the Native Americans to these liquors and spirits. And King Philip says, I've banned liquor sales again and again and again among the Wampanoag, and still the English make no effort to restrict their own people from selling this dangerous alcohol to the Native Americans. 6, the English cattle just kind of wander the forests and they eat the Indian corn. This goes back to the problems over land use. King Philip says that the Native Americans will go to one of their cornfields, in a distant part of the forest, to find that half of their corn is gone, and there's these a dozen fat cattle sitting around eating their corn. And when they take the cattle back to the Englishman who owns them, and they say, your cattle ate my corn, the Puritan settler just goes, take me to court. They go to court, back with point 3 again. And the English settlers always side with the Englishman. And if the Native American just kills these cattle, then suddenly they go to court, and the English always side with their fellow Englishmen. They find the Native American has to repay the man for the cattle that he killed, and if he has no money, they take the Indian's land. And finally, 7, the English intrude on the sovereignty of Metacom. And this is the issue of the praying Indians. King Philip says, look, you bring these magic books out, these Bibles, and you wave them around and you confuse people into thinking that they're no longer Wampanoag Indians, or they're no longer Nipmucks or Narragansetts or Wabanakis. And you make them live in English houses, and you make them live with English fields, and you make them go to English churches. You've got to stop this. Okay? If you are born as a Wampanoag, you live as a Wampanoag, you die as a Wampanoag. I don't care where you go to church on Sunday. You are always under the authority of King Philip. In fact, during the murder of John Sassamon, Plymouth intruded where it had no authority whatsoever. King Philip is apoplectic as he explains these reasons to Roger Williams. And King Philip ends Metacom's complaint with a very passionate defense of his position. And I've written out a quote of King Philip's words right here. And I want you to listen to what King Philip is saying and think about this. Is King Philip really in the wrong? And these are the words of Metacom. He says, the English first came to this country were but a handful of people, forlorn, poor, and distressed. My father was then sachem, that means king. He relieved their distresses in the most kind and hospitable manner. He gave them land to plant and build upon. They flourished and increased. By various means, they got possessed of a great part of his territory. But still, he remained their friend till he died. My elder brother became sachem. They pretended to suspect him of evil designs against them. He was seized and confined, thrown into illness, and died. Soon after, I became sachem. They disarmed all of my people. Their lands were taken, but a small part of the dominion of my ancestors remains. I am determined not to live until I have no country. The interesting thing about Metacoms Complaint, the interesting thing about King Philip's complaint is that Metacoms Complaint is going to echo through American history. Every time a Native American leader will stand up and make valid complaints against the colonial authorities or against the United States of America, they sound a lot like Metacom. We're being cheated of our land. You people are not keeping your word. You're not being grateful for past hospitality. You are illegally bringing in liquor. You are stealing our land. You are always siding with your fellow Americans against the Native Americans. King Philip's complaint is repeated virtually every generation between 1675 and the final end of the American frontier in the early 20th century. Keith, don't forget about the prophecy. Okay. Oh, yes, there's also a prophecy. King Philip has this dream, and he speaks to his holy men, and they put this dream together, and they say there's a prophecy. And King Philip tells this prophecy to Roger Williams. He says, look, besides, I've had a dream, and my holy people tell me this is a prophecy. They say that I cannot be killed by a bullet fired by an Englishman. It can't be done. So I'm going to go to war against the English knowing that they cannot actually hurt me. Roger Williams is completely crushed. Roger Williams knows he cannot stop the war from happening. He and his fellow pacifist Christians leave Mount Hope. They go back to Providence, Rhode Island, and they know what's coming. And it happens. King Philip launches his war. He attacks all across southern New England. He hits Swansea on June 27th. He hits Middleborough on July 8th. Dartmouth on the 8th as well. He attacks 2 towns in one day. He attacks Mendon on the 14th. He attacks the city of Brookfield. It's the siege of Brookfield. For 3 days, they laid siege to Brookfield, burning most of the town. They attack Lancaster on August 9th. And King Philip's soldiers can move through the woods like fish through water. They attack, withdraw, scatter in the woods, concentrate in another part of New England like that. The Puritans have no defense against this. They can't even believe what's happening. And if you see the picture right up above me, this is how many of these battles will take place. You know, King Philip and his warriors will move through the woods. They will begin to infiltrate into a town right before dawn. Then they will launch the attack at first light. The people that are caught out in the open are killed instantly. The people flee and they run and they take shelter in the strongest farmhouse. And then you generally have a protracted fight around this farmhouse because the Native Americans don't actually have any cannons. They don't make, a really stoutly defended building will thwart them. And so these fights often degenerate into these series of tiny little sieges as the Native Americans lay siege to these stout little farmhouses. And what the Wampanoag try to do is to set fire to the house. If they can set fire to the farmhouse, then they can drive the people out. So this is what it tends to happen, is that they try to set fire to these farmhouses. Often they will pile brush on top of spare wagons, set the whole thing on fire, and then push the burning wagon up against the side of the farmhouse. If they can manage to catch the farmhouse on fire, then the Puritans have to leave, and then they are gunned down by the Wampanoag, because they learned that from the Pequod War. And some of these fights are very fierce. Some of these fights are very, very brutal. The siege of Brookfield itself, that's what that's an image of, is really interesting. Like 70 Puritans take shelter in this one really stoutly defended farmhouse. They are surrounded by the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag attack and attack and attack. No, it's the Nipmucks. They attack and attack and attack the house. They can't break in. They decide to set fire to the house, and for 3 days they fight in and around this house, and they set the farmhouse on fire. They push a burning wagon up against the side of the farmhouse. The farmhouse is on fire. The poor Puritans are inside as the rooms begin to fill with smoke. Bullets are whizzing through the windows and whizzing through these holes knocked in the building. They know if they leave the farmhouse, they'll be gunned down by the Native Americans. And so they start to sing. They start to sing hymns. They start to sing hymns because they know that the end is coming. And on August 6th, a freak heavy rainstorm breaks over Brookfield, and it rains heavily and extinguishes the fires of the burning farmhouse. And the Nipmucks, the Native Americans, are like, oh, well, that's just not fair. And that ends the 3-day siege of Brookfield. And the Puritans cannot really fight King Philip at all. They don heavy armor, they don heavy helmets, they get their antiquated matchlock muskets, they get their big heavy pikes. They try to fight King Philip the same way they fought the English Civil War, in slow, massed formations, moving in heavy columns through the woods, and it is completely ineffective. As a matter of fact, King Philip ambushes one of these heavily armed columns at the Battle of Bloody Brook. He waits until this heavily armed column of soldiers and wagons burdened with provisions is halfway across this stream, and then he launches an ambush on both sides. The fighting lasts most of the day of September 19th, and he wipes out almost the entire armored column of the Puritan militia. And these are not full-time soldiers. These are just militiamen. These are farmers who are grabbing, grandpa's gun, and marching to war. Completely unprepared for the violence that King Philip unleashes upon them. Metacom especially turns his fury on the praying Indians of New England. And in red are the towns of the praying Indians. He attacks them again and again and again, forcing them to make the decision. Are you with your Wampanoag king? Will you fight with me? Or are you really an English Puritan at heart? And he forces these praying Indians to make that very, very hard decision. And in fact, after the war, you have a number of praying Indians that are like, I got forced into King Philip's army. All right, I didn't really want to do this. But most of the praying Indians turn their back on King Philip. And over 1,000 praying Indians crowd into Boston, seeking protection from the Puritans. And the Puritans view them with a great deal of suspicion. The Puritans, there's panic spreading all throughout New England, and then suddenly there's 1,000 Indians seeking protection inside Boston itself. Maybe they're just saboteurs. Maybe they're going to infiltrate Boston the same way that King Philip is infiltrating settlements all over New England. They decide that they cannot trust these praying Indians. So they take these praying Indians and they banish them. They say, we're going to put them in a single camp. We're going to concentrate them on this barren island in Massachusetts Bay called Deer Island. So they take all of these poor praying Indians that came to them for protection, that could have joined King Philip out in the woods, and they confine them in what can only be described as a concentration camp on this tiny frozen rock in the middle of Massachusetts Bay. Over 1,000 praying Indians are confined to this horrible camp on Deer Island. King Philip is unstoppable. Over 12 major towns are destroyed during this period, including Providence, Rhode Island is burned to the ground. Springfield, Massachusetts is smashed. It's completely destroyed. And over half of all colonial towns themselves are attacked, including Boston itself. King Philip leads his soldiers against Boston, and he attacks the outskirts of Boston itself. He fights a major battle at a place called Sudbury, which he wins. It's the largest battle of King Philip's war. He attacks at the Battle of Sudbury, and it's this very confused fight, and he eventually destroys the Puritan militia there. But he's lost so many warriors in the fight at Sudbury that he's unable to follow the success and attack Boston itself. In this tiny window of opportunity, over 1,000 colonists are killed. And some of them die quite horribly. They're scalped, they're massacred, Somewhere between about 8% of the entire population of Puritan New England dies in a handful of months. As these fights range all over the place. They don't know where King Philip is. King Philip is so mobile and he's able to move through the woods so rapidly that the Puritans basically start seeing King Philip behind every tree. They see Wampanoag soldiers in every shadow. They become so terrified of King Philip that they are afraid to go into the field to harvest their crops. Refugee populations crowd into the few remaining cities. They crowd into Plymouth. They crowd into Boston. And these cities start to run out of food. By late 1675, Metacom is clearly winning. King Philip is clearly in the ascendance, but both sides are rapidly nearing exhaustion. King Philip is running out of gunpowder. He's running out of shot. Some of the Wampanoag warriors are having to fall back on bows and arrows. He keeps trying to buy weapons from the French, but the French won't sell him anything. Nothing becomes of it. But inside these crowded Puritan towns, they're running out of food. They're running out of money. They themselves are running out of gunpowder. Now, it is during this period, during the winter of 1675, 1676, that a group of Wampanoag soldiers attack Lancaster, and one of the people they capture is Mary Rawlinson. They capture Mary Rawlinson, and Mary Rawlinson and her 3 children are captured by the attack on Lancaster. And Mary Rawlinson then spends the next few months as a slave of the Wampanoag. She meets King Philip himself. And she writes of this in her book, which she publishes later, called The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, in which she talks about her trials and travails as a slave of the Wampanoag during King Philip's War, and all of the things she has to endure and the enormous suffering she undergoes. And she loses her smallest child, and she's actually forced to watch, because remember, one of the goals of the warfare among the Eastern Woodland nations is the capture of children. She's forced to watch as the war captives take her 2 oldest children and give them away as war prizes to King Philip's war captains. She has to watch that. And Sovereignty of Goodness of God is, by the time we get to the 1680s and 1690s, it turns into this massive bestseller. It's published continuously for centuries. And Mary Rawlinson's account remains probably the best account of life among the Wampanoag during King Philip's War, as he just wins victory after victory after victory. Even though they're not having a good time of it. I mean, having to march like 50 miles through the woods in the middle of a New England winter is not easy. But bloody King Philip can do it. Josiah Winslow is incredibly frustrated, all right? They're not hitting the Wampanoag. They're not beating King Philip. The soldiers are so laden down with armor and heavy muskets and pikes and heavy swords that by the time they assemble their army, King Philip is gone. All right. And by the time they try to chase King Philip, these Puritan armies might be able to make 10 miles a day in good weather. King Philip can make 50, 60, 70. They just can't even catch him. Josiah Winslow is desperate for a win. If he can't find King Philip, if he can't find the Wampanoag army, he can find the Wampanoag women and children. And he knows where they are. They're with the Narragansetts over in Rhode Island. So Josiah Winslow summons the militia of Plymouth. He summons this large force, and he marches towards the Narragansetts, who are neutral in the war. And one of the people he brings with him is a man named Benjamin Church. And Benjamin Church is a really interesting individual, and we'll meet more about Benjamin Church, in a tick. But Benjamin Church is telling Josiah Winslow, this is like a terrible idea the whole time. This is an awful idea. And Josiah Winslow leads the Plymouth militia to the great fort that the Narragansetts built in the middle of the swamp. And the Narragansetts the whole time are like, do you really want to do this? Do you really, really want to do this? Josiah Winslow wants to do this. And on December 19th, he attacks the Narragansetts, not the Wampanoag. And he attacks this big fort held by the Narragansetts. And the result is this battle known as the Great Swamp Fight. And it's this horrific battle. They fight this heavily defended Narragansett position. They fight all day. They take terrible casualties. They eventually, as you can see from the drawing on the left, they eventually have to fight along this huge tree that leads into the Narragansett fort. There's a battle on the top of this massive tree. Benjamin Church is in the thick of it. And after fighting all day, the heavier firepower of the Puritans wins out. They overwhelm the Narragansett fort. But then they discover the only thing really inside is women and children and old people. The Narragansett warriors themselves, most of the Narragansett warriors escape. They flee over the wall of the fort and into the forest itself. But they have captured and they kill a lot of the old people, women, and children that they find in the Narragansett fort. And the survivors, they drag them back to Plymouth and they sell them into slavery. And the remaining Narragansett warriors go to the north. They show up at the camp of King Philip, and King Philip is like, "So are you ready to fight with me? What do you want?" And the Narragansett go, "We want English blood." The Narragansett nation joins King Philip's war because of the Great Swamp Fight. Things are going very badly for the Puritans. By late 1675, the colonies have to reorganize because King Philip is winning the war. They reorganize, and led by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in Boston, they do three main things. One, they say we need to coordinate ourselves. We need to work together. We need to revive the old idea of the United Colonies of New England. And they sign on. Connecticut, Plymouth, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts Bay all join together to form the United Colonies of New England, to pool resources, to pool funds, to have joint military actions. Somebody says, "What about Rhode Island?" And the United Colonies go, "No, we're not going to help those heretics and free thinkers and pacifist Christians. We're not going to help those people at all." In fact, the United Colonies of New England send a message out to King Philip in the woods. They're like, "By the way, we're going to fight you and all, but we're not going to help Rhode Island. So if you want to go down and mess up all those guys, it's totally okay with us." And Massachusetts Bay takes the lead in this because they're the largest and the wealthiest of the New England colonies. The second thing they do is they recognize the genius of Benjamin Church. Benjamin Church is basically the only Puritan captain who is achieving any kind of success against the Wampanoag. He's able to sort of take about 20 or 30 soldiers, go way out into the woods, and he comes back, and B, he comes back with captives, and he comes back with victory. And it's Benjamin Church who advised Josiah Winslow, you should not attack the Narragansetts, and if you attack the Narragansetts, you shouldn't do it in this way. And everyone recognizes that the Great Swamp Fight was this huge mistake. It was a bad idea, and it was badly fought, and that Benjamin Church was right about the whole thing. And Benjamin Church himself is this really interesting individual. He's a Puritan, but he spent a lot of time living with the Native Americans. So he knows what the Native Americans do, he knows how the Native Americans think, and he knows how the Native Americans fight. And they turn to Benjamin Church, and they're like, how can we win this war, Benjamin Church? And Benjamin Church turns to the United Colonies, and he goes, "You have to build me an army. Build me an army of professional soldiers. Give me the weapons, give me the money to build this army, and I will build your army for you, and I will beat King Philip." And they're like, "Okay, we're going to do that. We're going to do that, Benjamin Church. What else do you want, Benjamin Church?" And one of the first things Benjamin Church says is, "Get those praying Indians off the concentration camp on Deer Island. That is a terrible, terrible idea. It's unchristian and it's unjust. And in fact, I can use some of those praying Indians. They know that King Philip wants to kill them. So they have strong motivation to help me." So they release the praying Indians from Deer Island, and Benjamin Church incorporates a lot of those praying Indians into his new army. And they're like, "What else should we do, Benjamin Church?" And Benjamin Church tells the United Colonies, "Go to the Mohegans. The Mohegans are the only major Native American nation that told King Philip no. Go to the Mohegans, promise them anything they want to fight with us." And they do that. The United Colonies go to the Mohegan Nation and they say, we want you to fight with us against King Philip. And the Mohegans basically are like, you can't afford us, man. You can't afford us. And the United Colonies say, well, what do you need? And the Mohegans list a price that they don't think the New England can pay at all. They list this like stupid amount of wampum and guns and tools and weapons. And the United Colonies say, we can meet that. And the Mohegans are like, no way, man, really? And they do it. They basically give the Mohegans everything they want. And the Mohegan Nation agrees. And the Mohegans enter the war on the side of Puritan New England. Now, Church builds this army, and it's a really interesting army. And Church writes about this army he builds. It's in the historical record. I mean, he and his son years later write a history of King Philip's War. And in that history of King Philip's War, Benjamin Church basically details how he builds this army. It's not a very big army. It's only a few hundred individuals, but they are professional soldiers. They're not like part-time militiamen. And here is how Benjamin Church builds this army. One, no armor. Get rid of those heavy chest plates. Get rid of the heavy steel helmets. None of that stuff. It's heavy. It slows you down. And it's pretty much useless when you're shot at close range by a musket anyway. Makes a lot of noise. Get rid of the armor. No boots. Get rid of heavy leather boots. That's gone. The soldiers will only wear soft shoes, moccasins, and if they don't have that, bare feet. Okay? We got to make as little noise as possible when we move through the woods. When we will travel dispersed and attack together. He doesn't do the old Puritan thing of traveling in heavily armored columns down roads. Benjamin Church's army will travel through the woods. They will scatter, move through the woods in small groups of 5 to 10 men, and then concentrate in prearranged positions. Benjamin Church will take his army and say, we're going to meet at nightfall on the other side of that mountain. And then they'll all break apart, move silently through the woods, and then concentrate together. And if one or more of them get involved in a fight, and you start hearing the gunfire, then they all will congregate at that fight. Travel dispersed, but attack together. Speed and surprise are the best weapons. Move quickly, move silently. If you see a group of Native Americans down the valley or down the mountain, immediately start to move very silently towards them, get as close as you can, and then spring your attack upon them. No campfires. The light from a campfire at night will give away your position. A campfire in the daytime will produce a column of smoke that will give away your position. You either eat cold or you don't eat at all, because speed and surprise are your best weapons. He says we have to get rid of these antiquated matchlock firearms. The United Colonies must buy more modern flintlock muskets for everyone. And he demands that they buy him this stuff, and they do. He tells his soldiers that the only range to fire is point blank. Don't ever fire at medium or long range. Don't even fire at short range. Point blank range is the only time you should ever discharge your musket. And point blank range is about 20 paces. That's about like 80 feet. All right? None of this sort of long range shooting. Forget about it. You're probably just going to miss anyway. If you see a group of people you're going to attack, get as close to them as possible. Fire your musket, drop it, pull your melee weapon, and jump into it. No more pikes and spears. That stuff is good against cavalry, and yeah, it might have won the English Civil War. It's not going to work in the woods of New England. Get rid of pikes, get rid of spears. The only acceptable weapons are short chopping weapons. Heavy knives, tomahawks, hatchets, clubs, heavy chopping swords. In fact, if you go to a museum, there's a museum in New England today, that is the sword of Benjamin Church. I mean, look at it. It's not fancy. It's not this delicate European weapon. It is a short, heavy 2.5 feet of chopping steel. In fact, he got it off of a pirate. That's Benjamin Church's sword. It is a ugly, functional weapon meant to do serious business at close combat. And lastly, Benjamin Church says, never defend. Never, ever defend. Always attack. If you see the Wampanoags, you attack them. If the Wampanoags attack you, you immediately launch a counterattack. If you are ambushed, attack the ambushers. Never defend, always attack. And this is how Benjamin Church builds his army. This is the first American army. And Benjamin Church gives a name to his army too. He calls it the Rangers. And this is the origin of the U.S. Army Rangers. In fact, I have some like Marine buddies, and they hear I'm a history teacher, and one of the things they do is say, oh, you know, the U.S. Marine Corps is older than the United States of America. And this is actually true. The Marines were formed about a year before the Declaration of Independence. But I'm polite enough not to mention that the U.S. Army Rangers are 100 years older than the Declaration of Independence. The modern U.S. Army Rangers are the oldest military unit in American history, and they date all the way back to Benjamin Church's army. And if you're a former Army Ranger, what I've just described pretty much agrees with the Ranger book, and it's pretty much what they teach you in Ranger school today. Even though I don't know if they'll give you a pirate cutlass. That's pretty dope. They need money. They're out of money. And to raise money, desperate for funds, the United Colonies turns to slavery. Between 1,000 and 2,000 Indians are sold as slaves down to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. As a matter of fact, Benjamin Church builds his army, he equips his army, and then the United Colonies tell him, we actually can't afford to pay your soldiers. And Benjamin Church is like, look, this is war, man. One of the things you've got to do in war is pay your bloody soldiers. In fact, Colonel Church has to pay his own soldiers. And he decides to pay the Rangers from the profit that he's going to make on enslaving Native Americans. So they basically go on these huge raids. They attack these Native Americans. They'll capture these prisoners of war, drag these prisoners of war back to Boston, back to Plymouth, and sell them to Spanish slave traders. But even the sale of these 1,000 or 2,000 slaves is not enough. And the best that Benjamin Church can do is equal King Philip in the woods of New England. And this is particularly evident in the expedition of Captain Pierce. There's this Captain Pierce who's in charge of the Plymouth militia, and he's very jealous of Benjamin Church, and he ignores the warnings of Benjamin Church. The Wampanoag attack and then retreat into the woods. Stupidly, Captain Pierce decides to follow them. Him and his heavily equipped, heavily armed Plymouth militia charge into the woods. They are ambushed and killed. He leads these 60 armed militiamen into the woods against the Narragansetts, actually. They're ambushed on March 26th, 1676. 51 of these militia are killed. They're all killed, and 9 of them are taken captive. And these 9 men that are taken captive are tortured for days and then finally left to rot at a place that becomes known as 9 Men's Misery. Now, Benjamin Church eventually finds these remains because Benjamin Church goes after Captain Pierce. He's like, what is this idiot doing? And the Rangers find the murdered remains of these 9 dead men. We don't know exactly what happened to the 9 men at 9 Men's Misery. All we know is that Benjamin Church describes it as they must have suffered terribly. He doesn't give any details about the condition of their parts, but he buries the parts. He assembles a cairn over their stones, and Benjamin Church builds the first Veterans Memorial in America. And it's at 9 Men's Misery today. And this is what 9 Men's Misery looks like in the 21st century. It's way out in the woods at the top of this hill. And it's supposed to be super spooky and haunted, where these 9 men were tortured to death by the Narragansetts. So Colonel Church leads the Rangers against King Philip throughout the winter of 1675 and into 1676. But armies are expensive. Armies are really expensive. And King Philip had driven these refugees into Boston, into Plymouth, into these other big towns of New England. These outlying farms are completely abandoned. People are terrified to go harvest food because they see Wampanoag and Narragansett in every shadow. They see King Philip behind every tree. The harvest isn't collected. Not only do the United Colonies have to pay for Benjamin Church's army, they've got to pay for food to be brought to New England just to feed these people. And they have to start importing food all the way from England. New England has to import food. They have to pay for that. Basically, by the end of 1675 or the beginning of 1676, the United Colonies are bankrupt. They've spent all the money they have. They've raised all the money they have, and they've spent that. They've borrowed all the money they have, and they've spent that. They have to ask for money. Definitely by April of 1676, they are completely bankrupt. They have to ask for money. They either have to raise a lot of money to keep fighting the war, or they have to come to terms with King Philip. And Benjamin Church is like, look, either you find the money to pay my bloody soldiers, or you make terms with King Philip. But the problem is after things like Nine Men's Misery, after the horrors of Sudbury, after, they've sold 1,000 or 2, Native Americans into slavery, we don't even know if terms are possible. But there is someone who might have that kind of money. And the United Colonies don't like talking about this person. There's really only one person in the entire planet who is willing and might be able to help Puritan New England fight King Philip. They have to ask him for money. They have to ask Charles II, King of England. Oh. And they do it. They go to England. They kneel before King Charles. They kiss his ring. They pledge their loyalty to their dread sovereign. And they ask him for help. And King Charles II listens to them. King Charles II goes, aren't you the guys that cheered when they executed my dad? And the Puritans are like, yeah, there was some small cheering. Okay. And King Charles goes, aren't you the guys that have been saying we don't need the Church of England and we don't really need the King of England at all and we want to separate and kind of do our own thing in the New World? Wasn't that you guys? And the Puritans are like, yeah, we might have said that. Yeah. And then King Charles is like, and aren't you the guys that have been saying ever since 1660 that I'm going to hell and everyone around me is going to hell because we're not the elect and we're not chosen of God or anything? And the Puritans are like, and so King Charles says, okay, I will help you. I will help you. He doesn't actually give them money, but he allows them to take out loans in his name. So basically, King Charles agrees to be a co-signer on their loans, and they're able to borrow an enormous amount of money. So King Charles says, okay, I'm going to let you use my name to borrow more money. But I want something from this. And the Puritans are like, well, what do you want? King Charles says, we'll talk about that later. Use my name to borrow a lot of money. Win your little war. And then we are going to have a very serious conversation. Okay? You got it? And the Puritans say, we got it. So King Charles writes a letter to his agent in the New World, a man named Edmund Andros. And Sir Edmund Andros is actually the first governor of the Royal Colony of New York. New York was once New Amsterdam. It was taken over by the English. It was a Dutch colony. And Sir Edmund Andros is basically turning New Amsterdam into New York City. So King Charles writes Edmund Andros a letter and says, can you help out these guys in New England? They're in a kind of rough way with their little King Philip's War. Can you send them soldiers or something? And Sir Edmund Andros says, oh, I can send something much, much better than English soldiers. I can send something much better than soldiers. So Edmund Andros talks to these Dutch merchants who have been in New Amsterdam for generations. They've been trading up the Hudson River to the Native Americans in the Great Lakes, the Iroquois. So Edmund Andros talks to the Dutch merchants, who talks to the Iroquois. Can you help out Puritan New England? And the Iroquois think about it and say, we can. And they unleash the Mohawk Nation. The Iroquois unleash the Mohawk Nation on King Philip's War. And the Mohawk send massive war parties into the western part of New England, smashing these western refuges of King Philip. and smashing the old refuges of the Wampanoag. And this is a major strategic blow to King Philip, because you see, King Philip could attack the coast, and when he got into trouble, he could pull back into the western forests. But now the western forests are full of bloody Mohawks taking Wampanoag scalps left and right. The Wampanoag absolutely have to desert the western forests, and they just reel from the Mohawk attacks to the west. And the fighting continues throughout the winter and into the spring of 1676. The Wampanoag are forced next to the coast, and they're constantly scrapping with the Mohegans. They're scrapping with Benjamin Church's Rangers. But however, throughout the summer of 1676, King Philip's allies start to run low. His supplies start to vanish. Refuges and safe places where he can camp are increasingly scarce. Between the Mohawk, the Mohegan, Church's Rangers, and the newly financed Puritans, the Wampanoag position completely deteriorates throughout the summer and into the autumn of 1676. By the time you get to the autumn of 1676, the Wampanoag are on the verge of total collapse. Desperate to win the war on March 12th, King Philip actually leads an attack on Plymouth itself. You can see that there on the upper left. He attempts to destroy the settlement that his father helped build. The attack is a failure. They only partially break through the palisade. It fails, and King Philip, with his surviving Wampanoag, retreat to his old home at Mount Hope. But he is hotly pursued by Benjamin Church, who then lays a trap for King Philip. And they spring the trap in August of 1676. They attack the remaining Wampanoag soldiers. Benjamin Church left a special group of gunmen towards this one exit. They see the last of the Wampanoag fleeing, and a praying Indian named John Alderman stands up, sees King Philip, pops him right in the back. King Philip killed by a bullet fired by a Wampanoag Indian. King Philip is dead. They take King Philip's body, and treating it just like a traitor's body, they then chop it into pieces. They cut off the head of King Philip. Benjamin Church mounts it on a spear, and they walk back to Plymouth. Now, in this drawing is of course not accurate. It's supposed to be a drawing of Benjamin Church carrying the head of King Philip back to Plymouth. But of course, we know that Benjamin Church wouldn't have worn armor like that. He wouldn't have used a sword like that. Probably wouldn't have used a spear like that. But the head of King Philip is brought into Plymouth, and it's mounted in the town commons in the center. And in fact, the head of King Philip will stay there for the next 20 or 30 years. And it becomes actually like a primary tourist attraction. People travel to Plymouth just to see the head of King Philip. And one of the more ironic things about the head of King Philip is that the head of King Philip is mounted over the exact same ground that his father celebrated the first Thanksgiving. The war is winding down. They between the Mohawks, the Mohegans, the Rangers, they're just torn to pieces. The Wampanoags, the Narragansetts, the Nipmucks, these smaller tribes are just completely smashed. The Native American population is cut in half by the end of 1676. The broken survivors of these broken nations are driven west. They're driven into the south. They're driven into the north. Some of these groups hold out in like the depths of the northern forests of Maine. Some of them bitterly fighting on in the name of King Philip, into the 18th century. The last survivors of King Philip's War not really putting down their weapons until 1720. The war is over. But that mixed landscape of Native Americans and colonial Americans all mixed together, where one person can be another person's neighbor, that's gone. It's completely gone. The trust is completely gone. That mixed landscape is replaced by a sharply divided landscape. You have Indians on one side, you have colonials on the other, and that line in between the two is this new thing called the frontier. Okay? One of the lasting effects of King Philip's War is this idea that Native Americans have no place in the emergent society of colonial America. You have this line called the frontier, and it moves forward. You have civilization on one side of the frontier, and you have Indian savagery on the other side of the frontier. And the frontier is going to move forward. And when it encounters one of these Native American societies, that Native American society is either going to be eliminated, expunged, relocated, or reduced to a tiny, impoverished enclave. One of the implications of King Philip's War is the modern reservation system. The idea that Native Americans have no place in colonial American society and later in the society of the United States. But they've won their little war, and now comes time to pay the bill. The English crown under Sir Edmund Andros basically says, okay, all of New England is completely disorganized. We don't like how any of this is organized. We are going to completely reorganize all of these colonial charters in 1686. We are going to reorganize Puritan New England along lines that are more useful and more easier for the rule of the English king. First thing, they look at all of these colonial charters. This Puritan church, that's gone. That's gone. The Puritan church is forced to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Church of England. They are forced to acknowledge the overlordship of the archbishops and the cardinals back in England. Boston itself is forced to build an Anglican church. They are forced to permit this very limited freedom of religion. This idea that this is going to be a community of the elect dedicated to the Puritan church, gone. You are subjects of the King of England. You are not separate at all. The community of the elect, separate and apart from the Church of England, is no more. The separate Calvinist church in New England, and indeed autonomous Puritan New England itself, ceases to exist. These are now royal colonies. They are part of the British Empire. They must acknowledge the sovereignty of the King of England and the Church of England. Even though eventually these kings are driven from office, and Edmund Andros himself is actually replaced during the Glorious Revolution of 1689. After King Philip's War, colonial New England is clearly placed under the rule of the English crown and its royal governors. No more of these independent Puritan governors. Your governors are now royal governors appointed by the crown. And the next royal governor, a guy named Sir William Phipps, actually looks at New England and he looks at Plymouth Colony and he's like, wait a minute, why does Plymouth Colony actually exist? Okay, they're too small, there's too few people, they're not very wealthy. The idea that they're going to be in their own thing is just silly. And you know what, Plymouth Colony has never been on real strong legal foundations. So Sir William Phipps abolishes the Plymouth Colony. He chops it up. He gives the western third to Rhode Island, and the rest of Plymouth Colony is swallowed by the Massachusetts Colony. Plymouth Colony is formally incorporated into the Massachusetts Colony in 1692, and Plymouth remains part of Massachusetts to this day. You now have all of the information needed to answer that question right there. Who won King Philip's War? What was King Philip's War? Describe and summarize the events of the conflict. Who fought it and why? Who lost it? And finally, how did it end and why is that important? We've now come to the end of this section. And in our next section, we're going to talk about a series of decisions that are made down in Virginia and down in the Carolinas. And I will see you there.